The day Delia Abbott's wagon wheel cracked clean through on the main road into Harlan Creek, she did not cry, did not curse the sky, and did not look around for a man to save her. She rolled up her sleeves, got down in the red Oklahoma dirt, and started working. It was the spring of 1882, and Harlan Creek was the kind of town that had grown too fast for its own good, swelling up out of the prairie on account of the cattle drives that pushed through every season. The streets were wide and rutted, the storefronts were half-painted and sun-bleached, and the people who lived there had opinions about everything and kept none of those opinions to themselves. Delia had arrived 6 months prior with her daughter Clara, who was 4 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and her late father's stubborn chin. And together, they had set up a small bakery on the east end of the main street in a building that had once been a harness shop and still smelled faintly of leather and oil, no matter how many times Delia scrubbed the floor. She was 26 years old and she had already buried a husband, crossed 3 states alone with a child on her hip, and negotiated a lease with a landlord who had not believed she could make rent. She had made rent every single month since, and she intended to keep doing so. The wagon wheel had split because of a knot in the wood, a flaw deep inside the grain that had been invisible until the moment it mattered most. Delia had been hauling a delivery of flour sacks from the mill outside town, a bulk purchase that had saved her 12 cents per sack compared to buying from the general store, and she had been feeling quietly proud of that economy when the whole left rear wheel gave way with a sound like a rifle shot, dropping the back corner of the wagon into the dirt and sending 2 of the flour sacks sliding to the edge of the wagon bed. She caught the sacks. She did not drop them. She set them back carefully, assessed the damage, located the break in the wheel, and then stood up straight and began working out in her mind what tools she had access to and whether she could fashion a temporary fix to at least get the wagon moving as far as the livery stable. That was when Noah Slater rode up. He was not from Harlan Creek originally. Anyone who looked at him could tell that. He had the kind of easy-in-the-saddle posture that came from years on the open range, and his horse was a big gray quarter horse with the kind of legs built for distance rather than show. He was 28, lean but not spare, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been introduced to a fist more than once in its history. He wore a plain work shirt, dark trousers, and a hat that had seen better years. He was a ranch hand who had recently come to work for the Caldwell spread north of town, and he had been riding into Harlan Creek to pick up a part for one of the water pumps when he came around the bend in the road and found Delia Abbott kneeling in the dirt beside her broken wagon. He pulled his horse up without ceremony and dismounted, dropping the reins and letting the gray stand. "Wheels gone," he said. Delia looked up at him with an expression that was not unfriendly but was not inviting either. "I can see that," she said. "I can help you get it off the axle," he said. "You'll need a spare or a wheelwright. I've got rope if you want to lash the axle temporarily. Won't last long, but it might get you to Dawson's livery." Delia looked at him a moment longer than was comfortable. She looked at the wheel. She looked at the flour sacks. She looked at the distance between her and the livery stable, which was a good quarter-mile of rutted road. Clara was in the back of the wagon, having fallen asleep against a flour sack, and Delia knew she could not push the wagon that far without assistance. She knew this with a mathematical certainty that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with physics. "All right," she said. "The rope." He worked quickly and without excessive conversation, which she appreciated. He looped the rope around the axle and braced it with a flat piece of wood he cut from a short section of plank he had tied to his saddle for just such improvisational purposes. And within 20 minutes the wagon was moving again, slowly, and with a grinding sound that would have been distressing under other circumstances, but was now simply the sound of progress. He walked his horse alongside to watch that the lashing held, and she drove with Clara still asleep in the back. At the livery, Old Pete Dawson took one look at the wheel and shook his head the way a doctor shakes his head at a diagnosis he has already known for days. 2 days to fix, he said. Maybe 3. I'll pay for expedited work, Delia said. Still 2 days, ma'am. I've got other work ahead of yours. She turned to thank Noah Slater and found him already untying the rope from her axle with efficient, practiced movements, coiling it neatly over his shoulder without making anything of it. She felt something in her chest that was not quite gratitude and not quite irritation. It was something more complicated than either of those things, the particular feeling of someone who has needed help and received it and is not entirely comfortable with either fact. "Thank you," she said. "What do I owe you?" He shook his head. "Nothing." "I don't take charity," she said. "It wasn't charity," he said. "It was the rope. I've still got the rope." He tipped his hat, got on his horse, and rode off toward the hardware store before she could say anything else. She watched him go and told herself very firmly that she did not need to know his name. She found out his name anyway, because Harlan Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's name whether they intended to or not. The woman who ran the post office, Mrs. Ida Crane, informed Delia 3 days later that the man who had helped her with her wagon was Noah Slater, that he worked for James Caldwell's cattle operation, that he had come from somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, and that he had a reputation for being quiet and reliable and for not starting trouble, which in Harlan Creek was considered high praise. "He was in here last week," Ida Crane said, sorting mail with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing it for 20 years. "Bought a full set of stamps. Sends letters somewhere regular. Sister, I think." Delia took her own mail and said nothing about Noah Slater. She made her deliveries by foot for the 2 days the wagon was being repaired, loading a handcart with bread and pastries in the early morning and pushing it from one end of town to the other. It was hard work, and her back ached by the end of each day, but she did it without complaint and without asking anyone for anything. And when the wagon came back from Pete Dawson's livery, she drove it home with the satisfaction of someone who has made it through something on their own terms. She told herself she would not accept help from Noah Slater again. She would not need to, because she was managing perfectly well. Harlan Creek disagreed with her, as Harlan Creek often did. The bakery business was good, better than good. It was better than Delia had dared to let herself hope when she had first signed the lease on that old harness shop. The ranchers' wives ordered her bread and pies. The hotel bought her biscuits and rolls for breakfast service, and she had recently begun a sideline in celebration cakes for weddings and birthdays that brought in more money than the daily bread, but required significantly more art. She had a talent for it, a real one, not the modest, self-deprecating kind that polite women claimed. She could make a sugar flower that looked like it had just been cut from the garden, and she could pipe a border with such precision that the hotel manager, Mr. Hendricks, had asked if she had trained somewhere professional. She had not trained anywhere professional. She had learned from watching her grandmother and then from years of practice, and from the particular kind of attention that comes from caring about a thing. The problem was not the baking. The problem was the building. The landlord, a man named Gus Whitmore who owned 4 properties in Harlan Creek and ran the feedlot on the western edge of town, had been reasonable enough in the beginning. The lease was fair. The repairs he was responsible for had been made on schedule, and he had not given her the particular variety of trouble that some landlords gave to women operating alone. But in March of 1882, Gus Whitmore had a conversation with a man named Clete Braddock who wanted to open a saloon on the east end of Main Street, and after that conversation things began to change. Whitmore stopped making repairs. The pipe that connected to the water pump out back developed a crack that caused a steady drip, and when Delia reported it, Whitmore said he would get to it. He did not get to it. The crack widened through April, and by the first week of May was a genuine leak that required her to put a bucket beneath it and empty the bucket twice a day. She wrote Whitmore a formal letter, which she had composed with great care. He responded with a visit in person, during which he stood in her bakery with his hat on, and told her that fixing the pipe would require a rent increase to cover the cost of the materials and labor. "That is not how a lease works," Delia said. "Structural maintenance is your obligation under the terms of our agreement." "Times change," Whitmore said. "The terms of a signed contract don't change," she said. "Well," he said, and smiled in a way that was worse than an outright threat, "we'll see about that." She said nothing further to him because there was nothing further to say to a man who had already decided that the rules did not apply to him. She watched him leave, and then she turned back to her bread dough and continued working, because there was nothing to be gained by stopping. It was a Tuesday evening in early May when Noah Slater came into the bakery for the first time. Delia was wiping down the counter when the door opened, and she looked up expecting one of her regular customers but found instead the man from the road, the one she had accepted the rope from, and had intended never to need anything from again. He was cleaner than he had been on the road, freshly shaved, his hair slightly less in need of cutting than before, and he held his hat in his hands with the particular courtesy of a man who had been raised to take his hat off indoors. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. "We're about to close." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to buy some bread if you have any left over from today." She had bread left over. She had 4 loaves of the regular wheat, and 2 of the cornbread variety that she had made a double batch of because the Hendricks Hotel had placed a larger order that morning, and then sent a message canceling half of it. She looked at him across the counter and understood that this was a straightforward commercial transaction, and that she was a baker and he was a customer, and that refusing to sell him bread would be actively unreasonable. She sold him 2 loaves. "Much obliged," he said. She was wrapping the second loaf when she noticed that he was looking at the bucket beneath the pipe in the back wall, which had been recently emptied but was already beginning to collect water again, the sound of the drip small and persistent in the quiet shop. "Pipe?" he asked. "It's being handled," she said. He nodded. He did not say anything else about it. He paid her fairly, a fair price without attempting to bargain or to be generous in a way that would feel condescending, exactly the price she had named, and he left. She emptied the bucket. Over the next 2 weeks, Noah Slater came into the bakery 3 more times, always in the evening, always buying something bread, or a pie, or once the last of a batch of molasses cookies that she had made for a church social order, and had 4 remaining of after the order was picked up. He bought them all 4 without explaining why he wanted molasses cookies at 6 o'clock in the evening, and she sold them to him without asking. He never mentioned the pipe again. He never offered to help with anything. He was simply a customer, a quiet one who paid on time and did not linger and did not give her the kind of sideways look some of the men in town gave her, the looks that were simultaneously curious and calculating, weighing her as a woman alone against whatever it was they thought they might be able to offer or extract. She noticed, despite herself, that she felt easier when he left than she did when most customers left. There was no residue of the interaction, no necessity to sit quietly afterward and untangle what had been said from what had been implied. He said what he meant. She appreciated that. She did not think about it beyond that, or she tried not to. Clara had opinions about the bakery customers, as Clara had opinions about everything. She was 4 years old and had the conversational range of someone twice her age and the physical fearlessness of someone half her size, and she spent her days at the bakery in a state of constant investigation, examining the texture of flour with the seriousness of a scientist, speaking to every customer who came in as though she had known them personally for years. Most of the customers found this charming. A few found it startling. All of them found it impossible to discourage. Clara had spoken to Noah Slater on his second visit, climbing up onto the stool behind the counter where she was supposed to stay and informing him that her name was Delia Abbott and that her mother made the best pie in Oklahoma Territory and possibly in the whole world, and he had considered this information gravely and said that it was a strong claim, but that the pie he had bought on his first visit had been very good and that he was inclined to believe her. Clara had declared him acceptable. Delia had heard this exchange from the back room where she was sorting through an order invoice, and had felt, to her considerable annoyance, something warm and involuntary in the region of her heart. She squashed it promptly and went back to the invoice. The water pipe situation came to a head in the middle of May. Whitmore sent her a written notice delivered not by post but by his hired man, who knocked on the back door while she was in the middle of shaping bread loaves, that due to the extensive repair required by the pipe, her lease would be terminated at the end of the current month unless she agreed to a 30% rent increase effective immediately. The notice was written in the cramped hand of a man who was not accustomed to writing formal documents and had tried anyway, and it had the particular smugness of someone who believes they have outmaneuvered a person they have been underestimating. Delia read it twice. She set it on the counter. She finished shaping her bread loaves and put them in the oven, and then she sat down at the small table in the back room and read the notice a third time, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of what it meant. It meant that if she did not accept the increase, she would lose the bakery. Not the business. The business lived in her hands and in Clara's future, but the building, the lease, the kitchen she had built up with her own savings, the oven she had paid to have installed, the shelving she had sanded and painted herself on a cold Saturday in November. It meant starting over, finding a new location, renegotiating from a weaker position with a new landlord who would know that she had been displaced and would price accordingly. She did not allow herself to panic. She allowed herself 5 minutes, and then she went to the small wooden box where she kept her money and her documents, and she pulled out the lease agreement, and she read every line of it very carefully, and she found what she was looking for on the second page. A clause specifying that structural maintenance was the responsibility of the landlord, and a further clause specifying that the landlord had no right to alter the terms of the lease without 60 days written notice and the written consent of the tenant. 30% was not 60 days. This was the first week of May. End of month was not 60 days. She needed a lawyer, or someone who understood property law well enough to read the lease alongside her notice and confirm what she believed. There was a lawyer in Harlan Creek, a man named Prescott who had an office above the bank, but Prescott's fees were known to be significant, and his availability was known to be limited to those clients he considered worth his time. She had heard from 3 separate women in town that Prescott had declined to take cases brought by women, unless a male family member was co-signing, on the grounds that women did not have full legal standing in property matters without a male guardian or husband. She was 26 years old, a widow, with no male family members within 300 miles. She sat with this problem for 2 days, working through it methodically, baking through it the way she always baked through difficult thinking, her hands busy with dough while her mind worked. On the evening of the second day, she heard a knock at the front door of the bakery after closing time, and when she opened it she found Noah Slater on the step with his hat in his hands. "I heard about Whitmore," he said. Harlan Creek, she thought. Of course he had heard. "It's being handled," she said. "I know you don't want help," he said, in a tone that was not challenging but was also not backing down. "I'm not here to fix anything. I wanted you to know that the man who sold Whitmore that feedlot, a rancher named Patterson, had a similar situation with Whitmore 3 years back. A legal situation. Prescott handled it, but Patterson had to bring it himself because Prescott wouldn't work for." He stopped, chose his next words carefully. "Patterson told me the relevant section of law and I wrote it down. I thought it might be useful to know is all. You don't have to take it." He held out a folded piece of paper. She looked at it. She looked at him. She thought about her 5 minutes of sitting alone with the weight of Whitmore's notice, and she thought about Clara sleeping in the small room off the kitchen, and she thought about the bread in the oven and the rent she had made every month and the oven she had paid for herself. She took the paper. "Thank you," she said, and closed the door before he could respond. The legal reference was exactly what she needed. It cited an 1878 territorial statute on commercial lease agreements that made Whitmore's 30-day notice an explicit violation of her existing contract. She went to Prescott's office the next morning with her lease, Whitmore's notice, and the piece of paper Noah Slater had given her, and she stated her case clearly and without embellishment, and Prescott, whether out of a respect for the clarity of her argument or the specificity of the statute she cited, took her case. She sent Whitmore a formal response through Prescott's office within the week. Whitmore, faced with an actual legal letter from an actual lawyer, dropped the rent increase notice entirely. The pipe was repaired within 2 weeks by a plumber Whitmore hired with visible resentment. Delia paid Prescott for his time from her savings and considered it money well spent. She did not tell anyone that she had gotten the statute from Noah Slater. It was not dishonesty. It was simply a private accounting. What she noticed in the weeks that followed was that Noah Slater continued to come into the bakery, and that he never once mentioned the legal matter or the piece of paper or the situation with Whitmore. He bought bread and pastries and occasionally pie, and he spoke to Clara with patient seriousness, and to Delia with a directness that she found increasingly to be one of the things she most valued in a person. He did not talk around things. He did not manage her. In June, he came in on a Wednesday morning rather than his usual evening, and he bought a loaf of bread and 2 slices of the apricot pie she had just pulled from the oven, and he said, while she was wrapping them, "There's a dance at the community hall on Saturday. I thought I might mention it." She wrapped the second pie slice. She said, "I'm aware of the dance. Are you planning to go?" "I haven't decided." He nodded. He picked up his wrapped package. "If you do go," he said, "I thought I might ask you to dance, if that would be all right with you." She looked at him directly, which she did easily and which he did not flinch from, which she noticed. "Why would that be all right with me?" She asked, not unkindly but genuinely. "Because I think you might enjoy dancing," he said, "and because I think I'd enjoy it too. I'm not trying to imply anything beyond a dance, Miss Abbott. You can take it exactly as what it is." She considered this for a long moment. "I'll consider it," she said. She went to the dance. The community hall was a large, plain-timbered building that the town of Harlan Creek had raised collectively 2 years prior, and on Saturday evenings it became something genuinely festive. The long tables pushed to the walls, the floor cleared, the 2 musicians who played for these occasions, a fiddle player named Clarence and a guitarist named Will, setting up in the corner with a comfortable familiarity. People came from the surrounding ranches and farms as well as from town, and the occasion had a warmth to it that Delia had noticed and appreciated even from a distance, even in the months when she had been too tired or too busy to attend. She wore her good blue dress, which was not new but was well made and became her, and she left Clara with old Mrs. Greer 2 doors down, who kept Clara on these evenings in exchange for a loaf of bread per occasion, a trade that both parties found entirely satisfactory. Noah Slater found her within 5 minutes of her arrival, which she thought might mean he had been watching for her, and which she found she did not mind. He looked different out of his work clothes. He was wearing a clean white shirt with no jacket but a proper waistcoat, dark trousers, his boots polished, and he looked at her with an openness that was not bold but was not concealed. "You came," he said. "I said I'd consider it," she said. "I considered it favorably." He laughed at that, a short, genuine laugh, and she felt something warm and unguarded move through her. It was unfamiliar, that feeling. She had been guarded for a long time for good reasons, and she was not accustomed to laughing easily with strangers or near strangers or men she had met over a broken wagon wheel. They danced twice. He was a decent dancer, not showy but sure of himself, the kind of partner who leads without enforcing and follows the rhythm with attention. She was better than decent. She had always loved dancing, had danced badly on purpose as a girl to annoy her older sister, and then spent years developing the skills she had pretended not to have. And the second dance was a reel that moved fast enough to require full attention and left her flushed and breathing hard, and for the first time in longer than she could easily calculate, genuinely happy in a way that was not mixed with worry or work. Afterward, they sat at one of the tables, and she drank lemonade, and he drank coffee, and they talked. She found out that he had grown up in the Texas Panhandle, the second of 4 children, and that his father had been a cattle rancher who had lost his land to drought when Noah was 16, and that Noah had worked for other men's cattle operations ever since, moving from ranch to ranch with the easy practicality of someone who is skilled enough to always find work. He had a sister in Amarillo named Ruth who was 23 and recently married, and it was to Ruth that he sent the regular letters Ida Crane had mentioned. He had come to Harlan Creek because James Caldwell's operation was one of the best managed in the territory, and because he had been riding in this direction anyway, following a season's work north. She told him about the bakery, not the troubles of it, not Whitmore or the lease, but the beginning of it, the moment she had walked into the empty harness shop and smelled the leather and oil and known, with an unreasonable certainty, that she could make something there. She told him about Clara's father Thomas Abbott, who had been a good man and a kind husband who had died of a fever in the winter of 1879, leaving her 23 years old and a widow and pregnant. And she said this without self-pity because she did not feel self-pity about it. She felt the clean, sharp grief of loss and the forward motion that had come after it. Noah listened. He did not interrupt, and he did not offer platitudes. When she had finished, he said, "You built something real," and said it simply, as a statement of observed fact rather than a compliment designed to please her, and she thought that might be the most honest thing anyone had said to her in some time. "I did," she agreed. Walking home, he had offered to walk her home, and she had allowed it, which felt like a significant concession that she acknowledged privately. The evening air was warm and smelled of grass and wood smoke, and Clara was already asleep when she collected her from Mrs. Greer's house, a small weight heavy with dreams, and Noah Slater stood on her step and said good night and did not attempt anything more, not even to take her hand, and she found this quality in him. This absolute refusal to take more than what was offered, to be, in that moment, the most attractive thing about him. She lay awake for a while that night with Clara asleep beside her and thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything carefully. She thought about what it meant to be drawn to someone and what it would mean for Clara and what it would mean for the bakery and for the life she had built with such precise, hard labor. She thought about whether attraction was something she could afford, in all the senses of that word. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the dance floor, not like a problem to be solved or a woman to be managed, but like a person he was interested in, specifically, for the things that made her who she was. She decided that she would be careful. She was always careful. She did not decide anything beyond that. July came to Harlan Creek with the particular ferocity of a territory summer, the heat pressing down from above and rising up from the baked earth until the air itself seemed solid. And Delia's bakery began its morning hours earlier and earlier, the baking done by 7 so the heat of the ovens would not compound the heat of the day into something unworkable. Clara took to sleeping later as the summer deepened, and Delia would bake in the quiet pre-dawn with the back door open, and the night air still cool on her skin and feel, in those hours, something close to perfect contentment. Noah Slater had shifted from evening visits to morning ones, stopping in before his ride out to the Caldwell Ranch when he could. He bought coffee and a roll and stayed no more than 15 minutes, but those 15 minutes had become something she organized her mornings around without fully acknowledging that she was doing so. He was building something of his own, she learned gradually. Not quickly, he didn't talk about himself quickly, but in pieces, offered the way a man offers things when he has learned that offering too much at once tends to put people on guard. He had saved money. He had been saving for years, since before he came to Oklahoma territory, and he had a particular kind of land in mind, 20 or 30 acres of good grassland north of Harlan Creek where he had ridden and assessed and believed a small cattle operation could be made to work. "You want your own place," she said one morning in early July. "I do," he said. "How much land have you looked at?" "Quite a bit. There's a section north of Caldwell's that comes up for sale sometimes when the homesteaders who file on it can't make it through the first winter. It's not a kind country for people who don't know it." "No," she said, "it isn't." He looked at her steadily. "But it's a beautiful one." She handed him his coffee and did not look at him when she said, "Yes, it is." Things between them deepened slowly, in the way of things that are being handled with care by two people who know how much it costs to lose something important. They danced again at the community hall in July. He began staying longer than 15 minutes in the mornings, when the bakery was not yet open to customers, sitting at the table in the back room while she worked, and their conversation ranged over everything: the town, the territory, the politics of the cattle operations, and the troubles between the ranch owners and the settlers who were filing homestead claims on the open range, the question of what Oklahoma Territory might look like in 10 years, whether statehood would come and what it would mean when it did. She had thoughts on all of these subjects, developed thoughts, and he received them seriously. That was the specific quality of his attention that she valued most. He treated her thinking as worth engaging with. He did not explain things to her that she already understood. He did not soften his own opinions to make them palatable, and he did not expect her to soften hers. Clara adored him entirely and without reservation, which Clara reported directly and frequently. "I like Noah," she would say, at random intervals throughout the day, as though adding data to a record she was keeping. "Noah knows about horses. Noah said pronghorns are faster than most horses and that it takes a really good horse to catch one. Noah is coming tomorrow morning, Mama." "Clara," Delia said once, folding bread towels, "you don't need to announce every time he's coming." "I know," Clara said, busy arranging dried beans into patterns on the table, which she did for reasons that were opaque to adults. "I just like knowing it." Delia put down the bread towel and looked at her daughter's dark-eyed certainty and felt something very complex and very simple simultaneously. She said, "I like knowing it too," and Clara said nothing further about it because she had made her point. It was in August that the first of Noah Slater's invisible helpfulness became clear to Delia, and when she saw it clearly, she had to sit down. She had been approached in late July by a woman named Margaret Isles, the wife of the rancher who owned the second-largest spread south of town, who had commissioned a 3-layer wedding cake for her daughter's wedding in August. The cake was to be the largest and most elaborate thing Delia had ever made, and Mrs. Isles had specific requirements and the social confidence to state them at considerable length. The price Delia quoted was fair, and Mrs. Isles had agreed to it, and Delia had sourced the necessary ingredients, including a particular refined sugar that was not available from the general store in sufficient quantity, and had to be ordered from the supply depot in Guthrie. She had placed the order. The sugar had not arrived. She had sent a follow-up message. It came back with a note saying the depot had been unable to fulfill the order due to a supply issue and that she could expect delivery in 2 to 3 weeks, which was 2 to 3 weeks after the wedding date. She was solving this problem in her head. She could use less refined sugar if she compensated with the technique, or she could travel to Guthrie herself, which was a day's ride and would mean leaving Clara and closing the bakery for a day, when Noah came in one morning and set a wrapped parcel on her counter. "What is this?" she said. "Sugar," he said. "Refined, 20 pounds. She stared at him. "Where did you get 20 pounds of refined sugar in Harlan Creek?" "My sister Ruth's husband has a connection with a supply depot in Amarillo. I wrote to them 2 weeks ago." She stood very still. "You ordered sugar for me?" "No," he said, and there was something careful in his expression, something that was working very hard at casual. "I ordered sugar. I ordered more than I need. I have about 18 pounds extra that would just sit. You'd be doing me a favor by taking it." She looked at the parcel. She looked at him. She thought about the wedding cake and Mrs. Isles and the delivery that was not going to come in time. She thought about the fact that she had not told Noah Slater about the sugar problem, had not mentioned it, and understood with a sudden and complete clarity that he had known about it anyway: the bakery, her regulars, the wedding commission, the supply issue, because he paid attention. He had paid attention, and then he had quietly done something about it, and he had constructed the doing of it so that it arrived not as charity or rescue, but as surplus he needed to be rid of. She felt in the face of this a series of emotions that moved through her in rapid succession: irritation, gratitude, something that was almost amusement, and underneath all of it, moving deeper and warmer than all the rest, something that frightened her with its intensity. 18 pounds extra, she said, give or take. And your sister's husband's connection in Amarillo, he just happened to have 20 pounds of refined sugar available immediately. He deals in dry goods. He had inventory. She put her hand on the parcel. What did this cost you? Less than you'd pay in Guthrie. Noah. He met her eyes, and in his expression there was none of the evasion she had expected. There was something honest there, something that was asking her without words to simply receive what was offered, not as dependence, not as charity, simply as care. Don't argue with me about sugar, he said softly. She laughed. She had not intended to laugh, it escaped her entirely, real and unguarded, and she saw the way his face changed when she did, the particular quality of attention that moved across it like light on water. All right, she said. What do I owe you? The going rate, he said. Nothing extra. She paid him the going rate. The wedding cake was a masterpiece, Mrs. Isles cried when she saw it, which Delia had not expected, and the wedding guests talked about it for weeks afterward, and 3 new cake commissions came in over the following month. Clara ate the small test cake Delia had made to practice the proportions, and declared it the best thing she had ever eaten, which, given that she lived in a bakery, was a meaningful judgment. September came. The summer's heat began to ease its grip slowly, the mornings arriving cooler and carrying the first suggestion of autumn, the grass on the open range going from green gold to a deeper, richer amber. It was Delia's favorite season in Oklahoma territory, the one that felt most like the country acknowledging its own particular beauty, and she began to look forward to it in a way she had not looked forward to things for some time. She and Noah had settled into a rhythm that she was aware of and valued. The morning visits, the dancing when there was dancing, the occasional Sunday when the bakery was closed, and she and Clara and Noah went out to the grassland north of town, where he had shown her the land he was saving toward. Clara rode in front of him on his gray horse on these excursions, which Clara had negotiated with the ruthless practicality of a 4-year-old who has identified something she wants, and Delia rode the old bay horse she kept for the wagon, and they went out into the open country where the sky was enormous and the wind moved through the grass like a hand through water. He had saved enough, he told her on one of these Sundays in September, for about half the land he wanted. The section north of Caldwell's had come up for sale, held by a homesteader named Breen who had come through 2 winters and decided that ranching was not his calling. Noah had spoken with Breen. The price was negotiable. How much longer before you can buy it, she asked. Another year, maybe 18 months, he said, if the Caldwell work holds steady. It will, she said. James Caldwell doesn't let good workers go. No, he said, he doesn't. They were standing at the edge of what would be his land, the October light slanting low and turning the grass gold, and Clara was chasing a grasshopper with the focused determination of a scientist engaged in critical research. And Delia was looking out at the roll of the land and thinking about what it would be to build something here. And she thought Noah might be thinking the same thing, the thought running between them without requiring words, which was the nature of a closeness she had not sought and had found herself grateful for. He said, Delia. She turned. He was looking at her with the full, direct attention she had come to know and depend on, and in his expression there was everything he had not said across the many months of mornings and dances and sugar and rope, all of it collected and offered plainly. I love you, he said. I'm not saying it to ask you for anything. I wanted you to know. She stood very still. The wind moved through the grass. Clara announced a successful capture of the grasshopper and then immediately let it go, which was Clara's standard practice. "I know," she said. "You know." "I have known for some time," she said. "I was deciding what to do about it." "What did you decide?" She looked at him, at the plainness of his face and the steadiness of his eyes and the way he was holding himself still, letting her take whatever time she needed, the way he had always let her take whatever time she needed, from the moment on the road with the rope to every moment since. "I love you too," she said. "I was just being careful with it." He smiled, and it transformed his face entirely, opened it up the way a door opens onto open country, and she felt the particular relief of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has finally, by choice and on her own terms, set it down. He did not reach for her. He waited, and she closed the distance between them herself, which was right and was exactly as it should be, and she put her hand against his jaw and he covered it with his own hand, and they stood like that in the October light while Clara examined the grasshopper she had decided after all to recapture. "Mama," Clara said, not looking up from her grasshopper. "Is that good?" "Yes," Delia said. "That is very good." "Good," Clara said, satisfied, and went back to her work. They were not young people being carried away by a first feeling. They were careful, deliberate people who had come to love each other the slow way, through attention and honesty and the daily evidence of character, and the feeling between them had the particular solidity of a thing built rather than stumbled into. Delia had spent time deciding that she was choosing this, not being rescued into it, not being persuaded out of the self-sufficiency she had built at considerable cost, and that security was what allowed her to open herself to it fully. That winter, Noah did something else that was not help. He had been in conversation with James Caldwell about a winter project, a re-roofing of one of the cattle sheds that had to be done before the hard freeze. The project required timber, and Caldwell had sourced timber from a mill 30 miles south. Noah had volunteered to manage the delivery, which required driving a large wagon south to the mill and back, a 2-day journey. The practical effect of managing this delivery was that he passed through Guthrie on the return trip, and from Guthrie's larger supply depot he brought back, in addition to the timber, the following: a new set of baking pans of a size and quality that Delia's pans were not tin rather than iron, lighter and more responsive to the oven's heat, and 2 glass jars of high-quality vanilla extract of a kind not available in Harlan Creek. He brought these to the bakery on a Wednesday morning and set them on the counter and said he had been in Guthrie for the Caldwell delivery and had been passing the supply depot and remembered that she had mentioned her baking pans were getting old. She had mentioned this once, in passing, 4 months prior. She looked at the pans. She looked at the vanilla extract. She looked at him. "Noah Slater," she said. They had them in stock, he said, with the same quality of elaborate casualness that he had brought to the sugar matter. "How much?" he told her. It was a reasonable price, a depot price without markup. She paid him without argument because she had learned how to receive these things from him, not as charity, not as rescue, but as the specific, attentive care of a man who paid attention to what she needed and found ways to meet that need that preserved her pride entirely because they were always framed as something else entirely. Surplus sugar. Things he happened across. Practicalities. She had thought at first, back in the summer, that these constructions were evasions, small deceits designed to get around her independence. She had understood by now that they were something different. They were love translated into the language she was able to receive. He knew she would not accept charity. He knew she would not accept being saved. So he found ways to give her what she needed that were not charity and were not rescue, and were simply, quietly, the offerings of a man who had paid close enough attention to love her in the specific way that she could be loved. She thought about this late at night, in the months of that winter, and it struck her as one of the finest things she had ever seen in a person. In November, she accepted his courtship formally, which in Harlan Creek meant that he had spoken with her, and she had agreed, and they had appeared together at the community dance as an acknowledged pair. And Ida Crane at the post office had communicated this information to the entire town within approximately 48 hours. The response was largely positive. Mrs. Isles, whose wedding cake had established Delia as the premier baker in the territory, told 3 separate people that she had seen it coming. Pete Dawson at the livery told Noah he had made a good choice. Mrs. Greer, who kept Clara on social evenings, said nothing to anyone but baked Delia a small apple cake and left it on the bakery step with no note, which was its own kind of endorsement. Cleet Braddock, the man who had been talking to Whitmore about the East End building, did attempt to stir up some commentary about a widow woman keeping company with a ranch hand who didn't have his own land yet, and this commentary reached Delia's ears via the reliable circuit of Harlan Creek social information within a week. She considered it for approximately the time it took her to add the yeast to a batch of bread dough, and then she let it go, because men like Cleet Braddock were a constant in every town she had ever lived in, and their opinions had never once changed the actual facts of anything. December arrived with a cold that came down from the north like a wall, the kind of cold that turned the creek to ice overnight and made the mornings sharp and bright and still. Delia banked her ovens higher and started earlier, and the bakery was, if anything, more popular in the cold months, when the smell of baking bread crossed the street and pulled people in like a rope. She did good business all through December, and she set aside from that business a proportion she had decided on in October, savings toward expansion. She had been thinking about it for months. The bakery was profitable. It was consistently profitable, and the commission work, the cakes, the special orders was growing beyond what she could manage alone. She had been thinking about whether there was room to hire help, part-time to start, and whether the building could be expanded into the adjacent space that Whitmore had not been able to rent to anyone else for the past year. She had been thinking about whether she could approach Whitmore from a position of strength, with Prescott's name ready to invoke, with a clear record of rent paid, with the knowledge that she was his best tenant on that street, and propose a lease amendment for the adjacent space at a fair price. She talked through this plan with Noah over coffee on a cold December morning, laying it out the way she laid out everything, methodically, with the arguments in order and the potential obstacles identified and at least partially addressed. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "What's your main concern?" "Whitmore," she said. "He'll see it as an opportunity to raise the price." "He might," Noah said, "but you've got Prescott now and you've got a clean record. He knows a bad tenant to you now is worse than a good one. He's not a smart man, but he's a calculating one." "I think the same," she said. "I just needed to say it aloud." "Say it to Prescott too," he said. "Get him to look at the terms before you propose them. Go in with the document already written." "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. She smiled at him across the table, and he smiled back, and she thought about how easy it was to breathe in this, how little it cost her to be known by him, how different that was from anything she had expected when she had rolled up her sleeves in the dirt beside a broken wagon wheel and determined that she did not need anyone. She still did not need anyone. That was the thing she had come to understand, the thing that made the love possible without threatening what she had built. She did not need Noah Slater. She had proved over and over that she could manage alone, could solve problems alone, could build a life and a business and raise a daughter alone. The choosing of him was not necessity. It was not surrender. It was the act of a woman who had everything she needed and had decided to share it with someone who had earned the right to be let in. There was a difference. To her, that difference was everything. January of 1883 brought news from the Caldwell Ranch. James Caldwell was expanding his operation north and had offered Noah a foreman position, a significant step up in both responsibility and wages. Noah came to tell Delia before he told anyone else, and she saw in his face the particular contained excitement of a man for whom things are beginning to align. "Foreman means more money," she said. More money means the land sooner, he said. Breen hasn't sold yet. He's been patient. He's patient because you keep talking to him, she said. You know that. He looked at her with a slight smile. Maybe. The foreman work began in February. The wage increase was significant. Noah had calculated that at the new rate, combined with what he had already saved, he could make an offer on Breen's land by summer. He worked the Caldwell operation with the same reliability that had characterized everything she had ever seen him do, and he was good at it. She heard this from multiple sources, from Caldwell himself, who came into the bakery, and mentioned it with the satisfied air of an employer who has made a good decision, from the other ranch hands who respected the easy authority that Noah carried without effort. Spring came again. The second spring since Delia had come around the bend in the road and found Delia Abbott kneeling in the dirt beside a broken wagon wheel. And Harlan Creek moved into April with the particular energy of a territory that is growing and knows it. Delia hired a girl named Annie Burrows, 17 and capable, to help in the bakery 3 days a week. And with Annie's help, she began the expansion into the adjacent space, which Whitmore had ultimately agreed to under terms that Prescott had drafted and that were entirely fair. The expanded bakery had room for a second oven, which she ordered from a manufacturer in Kansas City, and a proper front area with a counter and 3 small tables where customers could sit, which was novel enough in Harlan Creek that people talked about it for weeks before they came in, and then kept coming back once they had tried it. Clara, now 5 and nearing 6, had appointed herself official greeter of the table area, a role she performed with a dignity entirely out of proportion to her size. She welcomed customers, asked them what they would like, and delivered information about the available pastries with the authority of someone who has extensive personal experience with all of them. Several of the regular customers began coming in specifically on the days Clara was at her post, and Delia observed this with a mixture of exasperation and fierce pride. In April, Noah asked her to marry him. He did it simply, in the bakery before it opened, in the early morning when the light was low, and the bread was in the oven and the air smelled of warmth and flour. He had no ring yet, he said, because he had wanted to ask her first and let her choose the ring herself rather than assuming he knew what she would want, and she thought that this detail was so exactly him that she felt the love for him in her chest like a physical pressure. "Yes," she said, before he had finished the sentence. He stopped. "I hadn't finished." "Yes," she said again. He laughed, low and warm, and she crossed to where he stood and he held her and she let herself be held, entirely and without reservation, and Clara appeared from the back room in her nightgown, where she had been listening for approximately the past 10 minutes, and announced, "I think yes is correct," and went back to bed. They were married in June of 1883, in the community hall, with Harlan Creek's entire population apparently in attendance, and with a wedding cake that Delia had made herself, and that was, by common agreement, the finest cake anyone in the territory had ever eaten. Clara wore a dress with blue ribbon that she had been involved in selecting to an almost exhausting degree, and she stood next to her mother during the ceremony with the solemnity of someone undertaking an important role, which she was. Noah wore a good dark suit that he had purchased for the occasion, and that became him, and he looked at Delia during the ceremony with the clear-eyed steadiness that she had known and trusted from the beginning, the look of a man who is fully present in the most important moment of his life and knows it. She wore ivory, not white ivory because she was a widow, and because ivory was the color that looked best against her dark hair and brown skin, and because she had decided on the dress herself and bought the fabric herself and had it made by the seamstress on the north end of town, and she looked exactly the way she wanted to look, which was beautiful in herself and no one else. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through Harlan Creek monthly, a good-natured man named Reverend Alcott, who had married about a quarter of the couples in the surrounding territory and had a particular gift for the concise. He kept the ceremony brief and let the afternoon speak for itself, which was the right choice. Noah said his vows without looking away from her, clearly and without faltering, and when it was her turn she said hers the same way, looking directly at him the way she had looked at him across every counter and every dance floor and every stretch of open grassland since the morning she had found out what he had done about the sugar. Afterward, at the celebration that went until well after dark, Delia danced every set she was offered and several she was not, and Noah danced every set with her that she allowed him, and the rest he spent watching from the side of the room with the expression of a man who cannot believe his own good fortune, which was its own form of happiness. Old Pete Dawson, well into his third cup of corn whiskey, found Noah by the wall and said, "I fixed that wagon wheel, you know. She paid me on time and she never complained once about the wait. That's a woman who manages herself." "I know," Noah said. "Good," Pete said. "Don't let her forget you know." "I won't," Noah said. The purchase of Breen's land went through in August of 1883, at a price that was fair to both parties and that Noah had been able to negotiate because Breen trusted him, and because Noah had been patient and straightforward in all of his dealings with the man, which Breen had recognized and rewarded with a reasonable number. The section was 22 acres of good grassland north of the Caldwell spread, with a creek running along the eastern edge and good elevation to the west that would provide natural windbreak in the winter. There was a small cabin on it, built by Breen during his 2 years of occupation, sound in structure if modest in size. Noah and Delia spent 2 Sundays that September walking the land together with Clara between them and sometimes ahead of them, ranging out across the grass in the particular mode of someone for whom the world is a constant and inexhaustible source of material. Noah talked about where the cattle could range, and where the water from the creek could be directed, and where, eventually, a proper house could be built. Delia listened and contributed and thought about what a kitchen would need to look like in a house on this land, what orientation would catch the morning light, what she could grow in the garden that would be useful to the bakery. Clara asked whether there would be horses. "Yes," Noah said, "there will be horses." "Good," Clara said, and ran ahead toward the creek. They did not move to the land immediately. Noah continued his foreman work with Caldwell through the remainder of the year, and Delia's bakery was at its most profitable, and it would have been foolish to disrupt it. But they began the work of planning the proper house in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table after Clara was in bed, sketching out rooms on paper, arguing pleasantly about window placement and the wisdom of a separate pantry, which Delia wanted urgently, and Noah was entirely willing to provide. He was a good husband, the specific kind of good that she had not been certain existed outside of individual days and individual men, the kind of good that was consistent, that showed up the same way on the difficult days as on the easy ones. He did not make her small. He did not take up the space she needed for herself. He was interested in her in the continuing way, not the way of a man who has won something and is done pursuing it, but the way of a man who finds what he loves more interesting the better he knows it. They disagreed about things. She was more risk-tolerant in financial matters than he was, and he was more patient in interpersonal ones, and these tendencies created friction sometimes and compromise always, and the compromise was usually better than either original position had been, which they both acknowledged with the characteristic pragmatism of people who care more about the result than about being right. In the late winter of 1884, Delia discovered she was pregnant. She sat with the certainty of it for a full day before she told Noah, not out of fear, but out of the particular quality of the knowledge, which was large and needed to be held alone first before it could be shared. She told him in the evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Clara already asleep, and she watched his face move through a sequence of expressions: surprise, understanding, and then something open and flooded with feeling that was one of the most private things she had ever been allowed to see in another person. He didn't say anything immediately. He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat like that for a while in the quiet house, and then he said, "Are you all right?" "I am very all right," she said. "Good," he said. He was still holding her hand. "Good." Clara was told the next morning and received the information with the gravity of someone who has been placed in charge of something important. She asked questions, whether it would be a boy or a girl, whether it would be able to talk right away, whether it would want to work in the bakery. Delia answered what she could and acknowledged uncertainty where it existed, and Clara took all of this in and announced that she intended to teach it things, which was, Delia thought, probably going to be true. The pregnancy was not easy. Delia had not expected it to be easy. She had been sick in the early months with Clara as well. But the spring and summer of 1884 were harder than she had anticipated. The nausea persistent, and the heat brutal, and the bakery demanding more than her body always had to give. She reduced her hours, which cost her, and she gave Annie Burroughs more responsibility, which Annie handled well, and which cost Delia nothing except a small quantity of her own particular need to do everything herself. Noah came to the bakery most mornings and sometimes in the evening as well, and he did not make a fuss over her, but he was steady, there in the ways that mattered, attentive without being suffocating. When she was tired, he said so without making it a criticism, and when she insisted on doing something herself, he let her do it and was there when she needed him, which was the balance she had needed without knowing how to ask for it. She told him once, on a difficult evening in July when the heat was unrelenting, and she was uncomfortable and tired in a way that went deeper than rest could fix, that she was sorry for being difficult. He looked at her with something that was close to offense. "You're not difficult," he said. "I snapped at you this morning," she said. "You were in pain," he said. "It wasn't about me." "Still," she said. "Delia," he said, and his voice had the particular quality it carried when he was about to say something important without elaboration. "You have never once in your life been difficult. You've been honest, which is not the same thing." She looked at him. She said, "Noah Slater, I don't know why you've been so persistently good to me." "Because you deserve it," he said simply and without drama. "And because it isn't any trouble. It's the easiest thing I've ever done." She cried at that, which she would have been embarrassed about under other circumstances, but was able to forgive herself for in the context of July and pregnancy and the honest warmth of what he had just said. He held her and did not say anything further, which was exactly right. The baby was born in October of 1884, a boy, solid and red-faced and extremely vocal about the transition into the world, and they named him James Thomas Slater, James for James Caldwell, who had given Noah the opportunity that had made everything else possible, and Thomas for Delia's first husband, Clara's father, because that history was not something to be erased, and Noah had suggested it himself. She had looked at him when he suggested it and thought again, as she had thought many times, about the particular quality of his goodness, which was not the showy goodness of a man who wants credit but the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself. James Thomas Slater was, by Clara's assessment, satisfactory. "He's loud," she reported, "but I think that will improve." She appointed herself his chief educator and took this role with full seriousness, spending hours beside his cradle explaining the world to him with a thoroughness that Delia found, at 3 in the morning while nursing, both exhausting and deeply funny. The house on the land north of Caldwell's was finished by spring of 1885, built by Noah with help from 3 other men, ranch hands he had worked alongside for years over the autumn and winter. A proper house with a proper kitchen that had the morning light Delia had asked for, and a pantry that was the exact size she had specified, and a wide porch that looked west over the grassland toward the horizon. Delia's bakery remained in town, where it continued to operate under Annie Burroughs as day manager, with Delia coming in 4 days a week, an arrangement that worked because Annie was reliable and capable, and had developed a genuine skill that Delia had been watching grow for 2 years. Moving into the house on a clear March morning in 1885, with Clara carrying her own small box of possessions and Noah carrying James on one arm and a piece of furniture on the other, and the wagon loaded with everything they had accumulated together. Delia stood on the new porch and looked out over the grassland and felt the weight and the rightness of it settle into her the way the first smell of baking settled into a cold room, filling every corner. She thought about the road, the broken wagon wheel, the rope. She thought about the moment she had told herself she would never accept help from Noah Slater again, and had spent the next 2 years being helped in ways that were never quite help, that were always something else, something she could receive without diminishing herself, because he had understood her well enough to love her in the exact language she needed. Noah came to stand beside her on the porch, James heavy and warm against his shoulder, and he followed her gaze out over the grass. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about how we got here," she said. "Wagon wheel," he said. "Wagon wheel," she agreed. "And rope. Best rope I ever owned," he said. She laughed and leaned into him, and he put his free arm around her, and they stood on their porch on their land in the late winter light of Oklahoma territory and looked at everything they had made. Clara appeared in the doorway behind them, having already established which room was hers with the efficiency of someone who has been planning this move for months. "The kitchen is good," she announced. "The pantry is very large. I think we should get a dog." "We'll discuss the dog," Delia said. "I have already decided," Clara said, and went back inside. Noah glanced down at Delia with the smile that she had come to regard as one of the best things in the world. "Where does she get that?" he asked. "Absolutely no idea," Delia said, with perfect innocence. The spring and summer of 1885 settled them into the land and the life. Noah ran the cattle operation with the careful, practical optimism that characterized everything he did, starting small and building deliberately, studying the grass and the water and the seasons with the attention of someone who intends to be here for a long time. The herd grew through the spring, 12 head to begin with. Healthy animals purchased from a rancher selling down his operation who had given Noah a fair price, because Noah had worked for him briefly 4 years prior and had left on good terms, because he always left on good terms. The cattle operation and the bakery were separate enterprises and both were solvent, which Delia tracked carefully because tracking carefully was how she ensured they stayed that way. She and Noah had a frank and unsentimental approach to the finances of their household, all of it laid out on the table and discussed regularly. No evasions and no patronizing simplifications, which suited both of them. On an evening in June, sitting on the porch after James was asleep and Clara was reading by the lamp indoors, Noah told her that Caldwell had offered him a permanent share in the northern section of the Caldwell operation in exchange for continued foreman work. Not a wage increase but an actual equity stake, a small percentage of the herd and the land, and that it was a significant offer and he was inclined to accept it. Delia thought about it. She asked the relevant questions: what the stake was, what the terms were, what it meant for their own operation, whether it created any conflicts of interest that would bind his time in ways that would affect the land they already owned. He answered all of it. They talked for an hour on the porch with the June dark around them and the creek audible at the eastern edge of the property and the sky above them enormous and full of stars. "Take it," she said at the end of the hour. "It's a good offer from a good man and you've earned it." "You're sure?" "I'm sure, but get it in writing from Prescott." He laughed. "You've become very fond of Prescott." "I'm fond of documents," she said. "I'm neutral on Prescott." He took her hand in the dark, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat in the June night on the porch of their house on their land, and listened to the creek and the grass and the distant sound of the cattle settling. And Delia thought about what contentment felt like when it was real and not performed, when it was the actual state of a life rather than the story told about one. It felt like this. Like her husband's hand and her daughter reading by lamplight and her son asleep in his cradle, and the pantry full, and the bread proving on the counter and the land stretching out to the dark horizon, and the knowledge, solid and unassailable, that she had built this herself, every piece of it, with her own hands and her own will, and the love of a man who had always known better than to try to do it for her. In the autumn of 1885, Clete Braddock's saloon on the east end of Main Street went out of business, a fact that no one who knew Clete Braddock found particularly surprising. The building sat empty for a month, and then it was bought by a young couple who turned it into a dry goods store, and Harlan Creek absorbed this change the way it absorbed all changes, with commentary and then adjustment, and then the comfortable assertion that it had always been this way. Whitmore sold 2 of his properties that fall, including the one adjacent to Delia's bakery, not to Clete Braddock, who had attempted to purchase it and been outmaneuvered, but to Delia herself, who had been watching for the opportunity for over a year, and had the documentation in order and the money set aside and Prescott's letter of readiness on file. She bought it at a fair price, expanded the bakery further, added a 3rd oven and a proper cooling room, and hired a 2nd employee, a young man named Daniel who had come to Harlan Creek from Missouri and needed work and was, as it turned out, a natural at bread making. The bakery at full expansion was one of the most successful businesses on the main street of Harlan Creek, and Delia Abbott Slater ran it with the same methodical precision and genuine passion that had characterized every day of her work since she had first unlocked the door of the old harness shop and began scrubbing the floor. People came from the surrounding ranches and farms. The hotel continued its standing order. The wedding and celebration cake business was now a significant part of the operation, and Mrs. Isles recommended Delia's work to every family of her acquaintance who had an occasion worth celebrating, which in the territory was a considerable advertisement. Clara turned 8 in the spring of 1886 and had by this point decided, with the characteristic finality of her decisions, that she intended to be a doctor when she grew up, on the grounds that the only doctor in Harlan Creek was old and made a lot of obvious mistakes, and she was confident she could do better. Noah, when informed of this plan, had said that he thought she probably could, and Clara had accepted this endorsement and moved on to the next project, which was teaching James to walk, a project James was cooperating with at his own deliberate pace. James learned to walk in February of 1886, at 15 months, and once he began walking he was immediately everywhere, with the rolling, determined stride of a small person who has identified motion as the answer to all questions. Clara supervised his movements with the vigilance of someone who has taken a responsibility seriously, and the 2 of them together in the house were a source of both chaos and a particular quality of joy that Delia had not known was possible in the specific form it took. The joy of watching your children be themselves, entirely and unguardedly, in the safety of a place that holds them. On a Sunday in April of 1886, Noah saddled the gray horse and the bay and they rode out over their land in the morning light, the 2 of them and Clara and James in front of Noah as Clara had been when she was 4 and James now insisted on replicating. And they went out to the western edge of the property where the elevation was highest and the view was widest. And from there they could see the sweep of the territory from north to south, the grass moving, the sky enormous, the creek a silver thread below. Noah had brought coffee in a tin pot, wrapped in cloth to hold the heat, and they sat on the high ground and drank it, and Clara pointed out every animal and landmark she could identify, and James sat in the grass and examined a pebble with the complete seriousness of a person for whom a pebble is the most interesting object in the world. "This is the best place," Clara said, which was not a question. "It is," Noah said. "Better than anywhere else." "I think so," he said. "I've been to a lot of places." "This is the best." Clara considered this. "That's because we're here," she said, with a 5-year-old's absolute logic, now aged up to 8-year-old's confident authority. Noah looked at Delia over Clara's head, and in his expression was everything, all of it. The road and the rope and the sugar and the dance and the morning coffee and the house and the land and the years of it. All the years of care and honesty and love given and received in the specific way they had learned to give and receive it, without losing anything that mattered. "That's exactly because you're here," he said. Delia held her coffee and looked out over the territory and felt the wind on her face, and thought that she was not the woman who had knelt in the dirt beside a broken wagon wheel and determined to need nothing from anyone. She was still the woman who could fix things herself and who would not take charity, and who had made every rent payment and built a business from a leather-smelling room and raised a daughter alone across 3 states. She was still all of that, and she was also this. A woman on high ground with her husband and her children and more love than she had known how to ask for, which she had received because she had finally allowed herself to receive it in the form it had been offered, which was always quietly, always respectfully, always in the language she could speak. The grassland stretched out before them in every direction, golden in the April morning, and the sky was clear, and the cattle were moving at the lower edge of the property, and the creek was running full with snowmelt, and James had found a second pebble to compare to the first, and Clara was pointing at something on the horizon with the urgency of a child who has spotted something important. And Noah Slater put his arm around Delia's shoulders, and she leaned into him on the high ground of the land they owned together, and everything that had been built was standing, was solid, was real. She thought of the rope. She thought of how she had watched him ride away from the livery and told herself she did not need to know his name, and how wrong she had been, not about needing him, because she had never needed him, she had chosen him, but about the name, which it had turned out she needed to know more than she had known how to say. She thought about all the ways he had loved her that were not love on the surface, that were surplus sugar and Guthrie pans, and a piece of paper with a legal statute written on it, all the invisible architecture of care that had held her while she built and decided and became. She turned her face to look at him, and he was already looking at her with that particular attention. The one she had known was meant for her from the first moment she had seen it clearly, and she thought there was a great deal more of it left to come, this life, this land, these children, this man who had understood her better than she had understood herself and had been patient enough to wait for her to catch up. "What?" he said, reading something in her expression. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He smiled, and she smiled back, and Clara said, "Mama, look, there's a hawk." And James dropped both pebbles in order to point at the hawk as well, and the hawk rode the April thermal in wide, unhurried circles above the Oklahoma grassland, above the grass and the creek and the cattle and the 4 people on the high ground, and the morning stretched out before them like country without a fence, open and theirs, and full of everything still to come.